Good afternoon, everyone. It's 1 p.m. We'll go ahead and get started. Thank you all for joining us, and we extend a very warm welcome to each and every one of you at our Norms and Behavioral Change Conference, which is focused on democracy under threat. We're very excited to be hosting you. My name is Sameera, Syed, and I'm the Managing Director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics. To start out our program, we will turn to the faculty director of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics, who is Dr. Cristina Bicchieri. And I'll give a brief introduction, and then Cristina will join us. So Dr. Cristina Bicchieri is the S.J.P. Harvey Professor of Social Thought and Comparative Ethics in the Philosophy and Psychology departments at the University of Pennsylvania. She's also the Professor of Legal Studies at Wharton and Director of the Masters in Behavioral and Decision Sciences program and the Philosophy, Politics, and Economics program, along with the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics, which is the center that is hosting this 3-day conference. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Dr. Bicchieri up to the podium for the opening remarks.
Okay. Well, I try to look at all the papers and the stuff that is presented and try, to convey some idea about all these things. Now, the center, as you may know, works on social norms, how they emerge, what makes them stable or unstable, how can they change, and how they can decay. Now, for the first time, we, did a little step towards understanding norms in democracy, or the norms that support democracy, a democratic system. Such system is built on a combination of personal and institutional norms. There are two sets of norms. And they are both essential for democratic stability and to fight authoritarianism. Now, there are some papers today and tomorrow about personal norms in inverted commas. There are papers about democratic attitudes, democratic commitments, and so on and so forth. And these are very general, if you want to call them norm, respect for the rule of law, so I obey the law even if I don't like it, their commitment to pluralism, so respect the fact that there are many different beliefs and they are all legitimate, okay? And last but not least, participation in civil life. This is very important. And voting is the apex of it, obviously. Now, are there threats to these very, very general, if you will, norms or even, values, because these are also values? And I've been reading very recently about filter bubbles. What are filter bubbles? Basically, the information we get, especially younger people who are all in the internet all the time, is filtered through one's preferences, basically. Think of Google. They have a fantastic learning algorithm that keep giving you information that is completely homogeneous to the information you are seeking. And I know because I have a brother-in-law who's a no-vaxxer, unfortunately, and I ask him, what do you read? All the information comes to me, through the internet. Obviously, he doesn't realize there is a learning algorithm that is, watching him. All right. So the question is, when we, in a sense, are in a filter bubble, are we still exposed to alternative information? Do we see it? This is an interesting question. And this question then is very much linked to there is a big literature. I was surprised looking at Italian literature. A lot of political scientists write about echo chambers. You know, bubble democracy is a big deal. I don't know if it's a big deal also in other countries, but in Italy there are lots of publications, and I was there on vacation, and so, you know, I read this stuff. And echo chambers basically is the tendency in information and looking for information, getting information, to homophily. I hope I pronounce it well, okay? So you stay with people who are very similar to you. And basically, homophily, there are several studies that show that leads to a tendency to polarization. So the more you stay with your group, within your group, etc., the more there is a tendency to polarize opinion. And, you know, this is a psychological tendency and is interesting, you know, something interesting to study. Now, one thing that I found very interesting, you know, there are a lot of discussion about trust, and trust traditionally has been vertical. Now what we see is an horizontal distribution of trust. What do I mean? I trust you giving me a certain information because you are my friend or you are within my group, and I trust you much more than information that I get from maybe a reputable source, but it's not reputable to me anymore. So this is very important. This is a very important element of this, what we call horizontal trust. So it's not that trust is dead. Trust is well alive, but has changed significantly, okay? Now, so when we stress identification, when we stress identification themes, when we close ourselves in homogeneous groups, we tend to polarize, okay? And I will come to polarization in a second because there are lots of papers about that. Now, let me look at institutional norms, because there are personal norms that support a democratic system, but institutional norms are equally important. Now, political institutions live within a set of laws and norms. Think of freedom of the press. In the US, it's part of the Constitution. There is a legal guarantee. In UK, it's not. It's a very important norm. You know, public opinion would raise against, you know, curbing freedom of the press, but it's not a legal institution, okay? So there are differences. Now, there is an interesting literature I have become aware recently that says there are two crucial norms, institutional norms that found democracy. One, norms about the institution, expressed by institution. One is norm of tolerance. You know, the idea is that your opponent, your adversary, are legitimate. Is a legitimacy, legitimation of the difference. Very, very important. And the other, which I like, is norm of forbearance. What does it mean? It means that within the law, let's say in the US, the president, Congress, the Senate can do a lot of things, and can do a lot of things against, for example, the president, or the president can do something, you know, that, like can pardon whoever he wants, and so on and so forth. So there are possibilities within the law to act in very extreme ways, and forbearance means restraint, basically. And a norm of restraint has always been crucial to the good functioning of democracy. This is very, very important, okay? And I like the sentence that I found in one of these articles: do not exploit the letter of the law to undermine its spirit, okay? So let's not use the law to the extreme. We can do that, but it will be ruinous for democracy. Then there are lots of papers about polarization, of course, polarization. Now, polarization, I must say, is the life of a democratic system. Okay, not extreme polarization, but some polarization is normal. I remember when I was a child, you know, there was a Christian Democrats and Communist Party, and there was polarization, but was respectful. There was, in a sense, tolerance, okay? They were legitimate to each other. Now, extreme polarization is a dangerous deepening of ideological divides, okay? So if we have extreme partisanship, we prevent compromise, political compromise, and of course, democratic norms are undermined. That's why we have all these talks about partisanship, etc. So what are the effects of extreme partisanship, okay? Respect for opposite views eroded completely. Public trust in institutions, and we see that eroded. For example, public trust in electoral results has been eroded, which is amazing if you think what happened, but it happens, okay? And core institutions, such that the courts or even election, are completely delegitimized. So it's a very, very serious threat. Now, we have several papers today that talk of polarization leading to democratic backsliding, okay? And in particular, I want to list some topics that are very interesting. They are all interesting, but some are really, you know, I never heard anything like that put together. We have talks, panels actually, about mature and young democracies. And what I wonder myself is, okay, what's the relationship between personal and institutional norms there? And are there some more important than others? And when they decline, what declined first? I don't know. I'm here to listen, to learn. Other talks are, how do we measure polarization? How can we have good measures of polarization? And this is a very important point. And when you know how to measure well, very often we also find ways to diminish it, to curb it. This is very important. And finally, how to strengthen personal democratic norm. There are some papers about that. And would strengthening personal democratic norms and value create, in a sense, a dam, okay, against, you know, the threat of institutional attacks to democracy? So these are some of the themes that will be discussed today. So I welcome all of you here, and I want to thank the people that made all this possible. You can raise Sameera, Joshua, where did he go? Nobody knows. He's there. Carl. And Nayantara, I don't know where she is. But anyway, welcome, my dear. Have fun.
All right, folks, so we continue, and next what we have, I'm just going to give a very, very brief introduction of the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics, because there might be many people here who are new to the center itself. This will be very quick, but just to share that the Center for Social Norms and Behavioral Dynamics, it's a research center at Penn. We offer consulting, research, and training services to institutions throughout the world. Some of our key research, this is some of the research that we've done in the past and institutions that we've worked with. And just want to highlight that, in addition to what we're doing today in terms of, and with this conference in terms of political polarization and democracy, a lot of our work has been, at least in the past couple of years, linked to examining poverty's roots within US communities. And I'll keep kind of scrolling along. And with that, let me just share what our program is for today and then the subsequent 2 days that we have tomorrow and on Saturday. So today, we'll just kind of dive directly into 3 talks that we have, which we're excited for you to be a part of and hear. What I'll say is that for each speaker, we've allocated 30 minutes, and that includes both the presentation and also Q&A. So what we'll have is we'll have 2 of our colleagues, both Joshua and Carl, will have roving microphones so that once we come to Q&A, the presenter can select any questions and we'll have a microphone come directly to you. So just wanted to share those logistics. After these 3 talks, we'll have a reception. The reception will take place just outside in the courtyard where all of the catering will be set up. Last little thing about Penn Museum, in case you're looking for restrooms, you just step out this door, you'll see a restroom on the right-hand side, or if that's taken, you can go down the stairwell and you'll see more restrooms there. Friday and Saturday, I'll go more into it once we get to Friday and Saturday, but this is just a heads up that our program actually starts, we'll have breakfast each day at 8:30 a.m. and then we'll start at 9 a.m. on each day. The programs that you have, physical programs, they have all of these details in addition to the email we've sent out, our website, etc. So with that, I will introduce our first speaker for today, who is Dr. Karine Nyborg. Dr. Nyborg is a professor of economics at the University of Oslo. Her research focuses on environmental economics and behavioral economics, in particular economic analysis of social and moral norms. She has served as president of the European Association of Environmental and Resource Economics and chair of the Scientific Council of the Bayer Institute of Ecological Economics at the Royal Academy of Sciences in Stockholm, Sweden. I'm going to bring up Karine's presentation, but in the meantime, if you can please welcome her with a round of applause.
Thank you. So let me see if I can manage these 2 things without getting too confused. So hi everybody, I'm immensely happy to be here. So my talk today is about image preferences as a driver of polarization, and this is a theory paper today. It is joined with my colleague Kjell-Arne Brekke, and like myself, he is an economist. He's actually also a mathematician. And what we're doing here is we're taking some, I think, to me at least, plausible social and psychological mechanisms and then putting them together, seeing how they interact with each other in the long run, the way economists usually do it, trying to derive a long-term equilibrium. But the topic itself and the elements that we put into this are really interdisciplinary in nature. So coming from an economics point of view, I'm really very curious to hear your views on this and any comments that you have. Is somebody keeping my time? Yeah, otherwise I'm going to talk too much.
Need someone to keep.
Okay, so our topic is polarization and segregation. I'm sorry about these pictures. It was too tempting. I realized I could draw on my touch screen with my finger. But the topic is serious enough. So our starting point is that ideological debates sometimes tend to develop into really deep social divide. It doesn't always happen, but sometimes, as we know, it does happen. And in these situations, each side seems to be finding their own view morally superior to the view of the other, of their opponents. And they also seem not to respect their opponents very much, like Cristina was talking about a bit. And then they also seem to limit contact with their opponents. We know that there are a lot of examples about this. I'm not going to talk about many of these particular examples since this is a theory paper, but I will give you some illustrations in a minute of what sort of mechanisms we have in mind. So, what we are doing here is we're setting up a mathematical model, basically, but I'm not going to show you much of the math. I'm actually going to show you a few equations, but that's only because the economists tend to be so confused if there are no equations. So you don't have to look at the equations. What we're doing is basically we're putting together a theory based on 4 main elements. And the first element is that we are assuming that people have image preferences. That is, you prefer, or you have a need maybe even, but in the model you prefer to be regarded highly by yourself as well as others. So, to be judged favorably by yourself, you need to conform at least partly to your own normative views. And to be regarded highly by your peers, you need to conform at least partly to their normative beliefs. And these two things don't necessarily, are not necessarily the same thing. So there may be a conflict here. The second element in our analysis is that we assume that there is some kind of, there is a dimension. So there is a potential normative disagreement along one dimension. So say from 0 to 1 or from left to right or something like that. So we assume that there are some endpoints to this, so you can go to the very extreme. But initially, people don't have to be at the extremes. Initially, the disagreement can be very minor, and we don't make any particular assumptions about how these views are distributed initially, but there is a potential disagreement along this scale. And then we make the important assumption that if views move to the right in this figure, for example, then getting a good image or being regarded highly is going to become easier for some people, but it's going to become more difficult for others. So that's going to be a crucial assumption. The third element is that we, in the long run, we allow people to change their social group affiliation. So every now and then, we assume that people stop and reconsider who do I really want to be with. And when they do that, they're going to, one thing they're going to consider is, will the people in the other group regard me more highly than the group I am in now? So will I get a better social image in the other group? And the fourth element is that we assume that within peer groups, there is social learning of normative views. So you learn these views. You start off with a particular view, and in the short run, you cannot just choose your view. We regard these normative views as, convictions that will be fixed in the short run. But over time, you will tend to learn from your peers. But we assume that you will not be equally eager to learn from anybody, because if some of your peers hold normative views that if you moved in their direction, it would actually threaten your self-image, you're going to be a little less likely to learn from those peers than the peers with views that would not threaten your self-image. So that's basically the main assumptions that we make. And when we put all this together in a mathematical model, what we find is that in the long run, we get a long-run equilibrium in which is extremely polarized in the sense that one group of people have moved all the way to one extreme, the other group has moved all the way to the other extreme, and they don't interact with each other. So I'll get back to the details of this. If there are questions along the way, please do ask. Otherwise, I will probably use my time myself. Yeah.
Just a clarifying question. When you say less eager to learn views threatening one's self-image, do you mean less eager to learn what your peers, the views from your peers, or the fundamentals of the views, or the distribution of the views?
No, so what I mean by this is that if, for example, I am an egalitarian, so I think it's fair that everybody should have more or less the same income, and I am in a group where people think that it's fair that the rich should stay rich, then in the long run, I'm going to move a little bit towards those people in the sense that I will become a little less egalitarian. Was that a response to your question? Okay, let's get back to it if the next slides don't clarify, because I'm going to give you a few examples now. Okay. Okay, so instead of delving into the technicalities of this too much, let me start by giving you two examples of the kind of story that we have in mind. So we were actually coming to this from work with an old model of ours on moral motivation, and we have now. We have written a companion paper, which is on my university homepage, which is exclusively concerned with this example. So what we are doing in this example is that we are assuming that there is income inequality in society. So some people are rich and some people are poor. And some people are more egalitarian than others. So people disagree on whether this initial income or this income inequality is fair or not. And then in this version of the model, we assume that the way you make people regard you highly, or the way you regard yourself highly, is to contribute to some public good. You make contributions to a charity, or you contribute to a better environment, or something like that. And then to be highly regarded, then people will look at how much did you contribute compared to what I think you ought to contribute. Now, if I am an egalitarian and I'm looking at a rich person who did contribute but not so much, I'm not going to regard him very highly, because I think that a rich person should contribute a lot. But if I am a libertarian, at the other end of my scale, I will probably think that rich and poor people should contribute equally, or equal shares of their income. So then I will regard more of the poor people and less of the rich people. So the more egalitarian you get, the more you will demand from the rich and the less you will demand from the poor. Now that is going to mean that the rich, in the long term, they're going to avoid egalitarian peers and prefer libertarian peers. And the rich are going to be more reluctant to adopt egalitarian views, but for the poor it's going to be the opposite. So in the long run, we find that there is complete segregation between the rich and poor. So the poor are in their groups and the rich are in their groups. And there is extreme polarization in the sense that the rich are perfect libertarians, so they all agree that the current income distribution is fair, while the poor are perfect egalitarians, thinking that there should really be a lot of income redistribution. And in this model, we actually also find that in the long run, voluntary contributions to the public good are going to be minimal, because everybody is surrounded by peers telling them that it is the others who should really contribute more. Okay, so that's one example, yes.
Sorry, that's not my voice. Well, thank you very much. How does the social mobility assumption work in that case? Like, you can't decide if you're rich or poor, right? So what is the assumption, what does that apply, how does that apply?
Which assumption?
I can't remember what you called it, but basically the idea that you could reassess which group you want to belong to periodically. Social mobility, did you call that?
Yeah, so I'm not sure if I got exactly what you're asking about, but actually in this paper we are assuming a particular kind of moral reasoning that implies endogenously that if you are a libertarian, you will demand high contributions from a rich person to regard her highly.
Sorry, could you go back to the slide where you put your 4 assumptions?
Yeah.
Please, I apologize. I'm just trying to understand how it works.
This one?
The previous slide. Yeah, social migration, that's what we called it, sorry. How does social migration work in that example you just gave?
Okay, thank you. So social migration in that case means that initially social groups can be mixed with rich and poor, libertarians, egalitarians, but every now and then people ask themselves, who do I really want to be with? Then if one group is on average a little more egalitarian than the others, then the poor people will prefer to go there. Was that an answer to your question? Yes. Okay, thank you.
Just one more question. So, and what drives this? Is it change in information or the change in preferences?
It's not a change in information, it's not a change in preferences. I will show you the model very shortly. What is driving it is simply that it's costly for people to keep a good self-image and a good social image, and dynamic social forces are going to be set in force to make this easier for people, to reduce their image costs, and that is what is driving them. Yes. Yes. So ask me again if you're not convinced after a few more slides. Okay. Here's another example. Maybe I should have shown you the model first, but okay. So this could be highly educated, say, people with a college education and people without college education, for example. And now assume that the normative views that people may disagree on is not decency, what makes you a good person or something like that, but whether they have high or low trust in science-based type of reasoning, or whether they rather trust intuitive, personal experience-based reasoning. And in this case, so having a good image would be being somebody who is regarded highly and is worth being listened to. Then if I become, say I'm highly educated and my normative views change, so I become more skeptical to science-based arguments, my self-image is going to be threatened by that. And the same thing if my peers change their views, then if my peers become more mistrusting in science, then my social image is going to suffer. In this case, I am going to try to avoid science-skeptical peers, but the uneducated will prefer science-based peers. And I will also be reluctant to listen to learn from people around me who are skeptical to science-based reasoning, but the opposite will be true for those with a low education. So in the long run, we show in the paper that in the absence of counteracting forces, this would lead to full segregation in uneducated people flock together, and as the highly educated also do, and they hold extremely different views on whether you can trust science-based reasoning or not. Okay, so let me show you the model a little bit more explicitly. I'm not going to go into the technical details, but assume that we have two types of people, rich and poor, educated, uneducated, something like that. And I'm going to call them P and R. And who is which type is going to be fixed throughout. And then initially people will belong to separate social groups, but there is no particular assumption about how they are distributed into those groups. And people may hold different normative views. Initially, they don't need to differ much, but there must be a slight little difference. But these things may change over time. So in the short run, we assume that normative views are convictions. You cannot simply choose them. So in the short run, you take them as given. And which group you are part of is you also take that as given in the short run. And what views and groups others hold and are in as well. And then your image is going to depend on three things. It's going to depend on whether what type you are, if you're rich or poor, for example. It's going to depend on what normative views you have. I'll get back to this shortly. But it's also going to depend on effort. So if I'm a type that is not highly respected in society, for example, or in my group, I may work hard to become better at what is highly respected. I may work a lot to learn a different way of arguing, for example. And then we assume that people care about their self-image, their social image, and we assume that there is some cost of exerting effort, so you don't really want to make more effort than you need to. And then possibly there may also be some benefit from these efforts. So for example, in the rich and poor model, this is public good, for example, environmental quality that people contribute to. But for what I will be talking about today, you don't really need to think of that benefit. The effort could really be just some kind of signaling effort that I am doing a lot just to show my peers that I'm very committed or something like that. Right. And then we are assuming that that image is strictly increasing in how much effort you put in. It should say concave and strictly increasing in effort. I think that's, yeah. And self-image is going to depend on your effort, what type you are, and what normative views you have yourself, whilst your social image is going to depend on effort, your type, and the average of the normative views of people in your peer group. Okay. And now we are assuming that if I am a P-type, and normative views are moving to the right in this figure, it's going to become harder for me to get a good self-image. And similarly, if other people are moving towards the right in this figure, and I'm a P-type, it's going to become harder for me to get a good social image. But for the R-types, the rich, for example, it's going to be the opposite. So, and this means that if I'm a P-type, my utility is going to go down if we move towards the right in the figure, because either I have to accept that my image becomes poorer, or I have to work harder, which is also a cost to me. But for the R-types, it's the opposite. So their utility is increasing if you move to the left in the figure. Okay. Then we add the dynamic parts of the analysis. So what I showed you now was the static part. And then we add what's happening more in the long run. Okay, so assume now that each period you meet somebody else, one other person in your own peer group. And and you try to judge what is the view of that other person. You cannot know exactly what is the normative view of another person, but you can make a guess based on what she's saying to you or how she behaves. So you imperfectly observe the other's normative view, and then you move a little bit. You move your own view a little bit towards hers. So you adapt a little bit. You know, there is no such thing as a objectively correct normative view, so it's reasonable to assume that partly this is, over time, it is partly learned. But you move a little less towards that other person if such a move would threaten your self-image, okay? So you move more if others have a view that is implicitly pleasant to you than if they have a view that is implicitly unpleasant to you. Now, this is for the economist. I think we just skip it. Okay. Then we add the migration. So assume now, to make things simple, that there are only two social groups. And every now and then, I ask myself, would they like me better in the other group? And when judging what is the answer to that question, the P-types are going to prefer groups where the average normative view is low, to the left in my figure. And the R-types are going to prefer social groups where the average view is to the right in the figure. Okay, again, let's just skip this. It's just there to impress you. Okay, so, okay. I think, yeah, okay. This is what I wanted to show you now. So this is the main result of the paper. We show that given these, let me mention one thing before I move here. So in the learning mechanism, we are assuming that, so we are assuming here that there is a little bit of an uncertainty. So even if there wasn't reluctance in social learning, and even if there wasn't uncertainty, people would move in separate directions and segregate, as I have been explaining. But when we have some uncertainty here and this reluctance, the effect of that is that the initial difference between groups can move way beyond what the average difference was initially, and you can get all the way to the extremes. So the uncertainty and the reluctance is essential for that. Okay, so here's the main result. In the long run equilibrium, when all this has been working together for a long time, we find that everybody who is initially in, well, I shouldn't say initially because this is fixed. Everybody in the R group, the educated, for example, socialize with each other, and they hold the extreme view to the right in my figure, for example, trust and scientific reasoning, while all the others, the uneducated, for example, socialize together, not with the R's, and they hold the other extreme view. We also find that, so this assumes that all social learning happens within the social group. What if some of the learning takes place from people you are not regularly interacting with? Like Cristina was mentioning, this Google algorithms that give you the news and the opinions that you want to have. So, if part of your learning is coming from, not from your peers, but partly from the other group, then there will be segregation and there will be some polarization, but the polarization will be limited in the long-term equilibrium. And the reverse of that is, of course, that if we start from a situation where we have segregation and polarization, but the polarization is limited, and then less of our learning comes from other outside sources than before. for example, because of these learning algorithms, then that will increase polarization, as that's a result of the paper. So to sum up and conclude, if it is the case that when normative views change towards one of the extremes, then, and if it is the case that that changes who is regarded more or less highly by themselves and their peers, then this will push society in a direction of polarization and segregation. And if you don't have any counteracting forces here, it will end up in a situation where people from different groups or different types, they don't interact. Each group is convinced that the view that they have is the normatively superior one. So it's going to be a conviction, not only something they pretend to think. And because of this, and because everybody also tried to behave in accordance with the prevailing normative views, they're going to have low regard and low respect for the members of the other social groups. Now, we have concentrated our efforts on describing these driving forces, driving polarization. We have not really explored so much yet, at least, counteracting factors. And I hope that maybe somebody else would also like to explore that. So, for example, you could imagine that if there are economic incentives to interact with people you don't really like, for example, you can earn money from trading with them, that may be one counteracting force. Another one could be more social incentives. There may be some reasons why you want to be able to socialize even with people you don't like. For example, at work, and that may be one counteracting force. And finally, if the normative disagreement is not only along one dimension, but it's several different dimensions and more heterogeneity in types, then that could also limit. I guess this remains to be explored, but my intuition is that that would also possibly reduce or somehow limit polarization in the long-term equilibrium. So that's basically what I had. I hope I didn't spend way too much time. Thank you.
I have a question. Thank you. First of all, I want to ask you the following. You assume two psychological forces at the beginning. I want self-respect from myself, but I want to be respected by others. And you try to show how we evolve from dishomogeneous to very homogeneous groups. And of course, then efforts plays an important role, et cetera, and social learning. What if we instead think that my image depends on my type, which includes my values, preference, that's my image, and because of the image I have of myself and my preference, I aggregate with similar people. You know, I don't care about other people. I want to be with people that think like me, okay? So there is very little evolution. It's not from a dishomogeneous to homogeneous group. I go into a small homogeneous group where there is very little effort because they think like me. We're there together. So in this case, think of networks. I create my own little network or set of little networks where there is no learning. There is no social learning. Okay. Now, in your model instead, because you have this psychological assumption initially, but together with the psychological assumption, you have to assume that there are dishomogeneous groups. You start with the dishomogeneous group. You start with the idea there are different viewpoints, and then there is the problem you know, where I stand there. Why do you choose this instead of thinking, you know, that's what happened with the internet. I have my preference, I look for something very similar to me, and I don't move from there, basically. You know, that's what let's confess. That's what we do. We're not looking for opposition or difference, etc. We look for something similar. So why do you instead move from this very different assumption?
Thank you. That's a great question. I think what you are describing is really what is happening inside of my steady state. So I guess what I'm trying to demonstrate is that if you start from a different situation from that, and you don't put any counteracting forces into the picture, then you are going to end up where at the point you are describing. And I think that what you are describing is really the steady state in the model. Yes, yes.
What sort of counteracting forces?
Okay, so in the model, so far we have only one, and that is that some of the learning does not come from the others in your group, but it comes from somewhere else. So if, for example, like we did in Norway when I was young, everybody was watching the same television programs, you know? So we had a lot of learning that was not from our own social groups, and that will limit the polarization. That's the only thing that is in there now. But as I mentioned, towards the end, I think, for example, if there was an incentive to trade with people in the other group, then you might have to learn some things from them. So that could be, but this is speculation on my part because that's currently not in the model. So other incentives to actually keep in touch with people you don't really like would counteract this.
That's a difficult thing to do. Any more questions?
So yeah, I wanted to get back to my question. So now I get a bit better with the law of motion of the norm, no? But in a way, like whether it's preferences or information is under the rug, right? Because in a way you have the law of motions, people, you know, wanna like move closer or further away for these different motives, but what is really going on at the micro level, right? So in a way, like they have the norms, is it about some sort of beliefs that are being changed, and that would be sort of information, or is it, or you choose optimally your preferences to be closer to other people? So in a way, like right now it's like this abstract concept of the norm that evolves through the law of motion, but you know, what do we think is going on underneath? If it's neither information nor preferences, I don't, what else is moving?
I have to admit that I struggle to follow your question because I'm not a native English speaker and you're speaking a little bit fast. Yeah. So I was struggling to follow.
Let's step back, you know, what is a norm, right? Essentially, it's like you have some beliefs. So preferences, it could be like preferences, it could be some beliefs about the equilibrium that we should play. Right? So you're talking about my Q variable. Right, yeah, that's a law of motion, no? Of essentially what like explains dynamic movement of the norm. Right. Which is basically what drives the whole model. Yeah. Right? So in a way, so what's under, if it's not information nor preferences, what moves the norm? Right, so preferences in the economic sense in this model would be the utility function where I care about self-image, I care about social image and costs. And that one does not change throughout the process. So in that sense, preferences are fixed. But in addition to this, you have some normative beliefs, value views, right? That determines who you regard highly and less highly. So that is what is changing over time as a result of social learning, right? So that could be, for example, whether I find the current income distribution fair or whether I find it highly unfair. It could be whether I... So that's a great example, yeah, but okay. But it could be that I find it unfair because I now have some information about people's efforts, right? So essentially, and the change of my norm perception comes from an updating of what's going on in the world, right? Right, so you know, these normative views could be based on factual premises. So in that case, factual information could matter. So we have one example in the paper
about climate change. So if you have the two groups initially, it is those who are heavily invested in fossil fuel activities and those who are more heavily invested in greener activities. And then the Q variable is whether you find activities emitting greenhouse gases morally indefensible, or whether you think that's a great thing because it helps prosperity and growth and things like that. Then where you are on that scale might be determined partly by your actual beliefs in whether climate change is man-made or not, right? So in that sense, changed information could affect your normative views. But in the model, as we put it up, that is not essential. It's one possible way that it can occur. But basically, we simply assume that what you think is right and wrong is partially learned by others, not because there is some new information or change preferences in the sense of utility functions, but it's simply because it is inherently normative, and there is no objective answer to what is normatively right. So that is why we find it reasonable to assume that that is at least partly learned by your peers. Was that an answer?
Thank you very much. Christoph Abels, I'm from the University of Potsdam, and my question concerns misinformation. In particular, whether you think there could be space for some kind of backfiring effect once I learn about another group, but at some point, so I want to be part of that group, but at some point I find out actually these people betrayed me and deceived me into liking them more than I actually should. Do you think there could be space for some kind of backfiring, that I actually become more polarized as a result of this experience than less?
So did I get that correctly? So you're saying that you feel, for some reason, you feel mistreated by your group?
Misinformed.
Misinformed. Okay. Well, you know, that might happen if your change in view is actually caused by a change in information and that information turns out to be wrong. I guess that could happen. In the model, as I just discussed, this normative view is not necessarily based on any factual premises. It could be simply, do I think that that inequality is fair, or do I think that a better world would be a place where everybody were equal or having equal incomes? So it can be purely normative. But of course, if it is partly determined by some factual beliefs, I guess at least intuitively, it seems reasonable what you're saying, but it's not really modeled here.
Okay, thank you.
All right, and so as folks kind of grab something to eat or drink, we'll continue to move along in our program for today. Our next speaker is Dr. Cesar Vargas Nunez, who is an assistant professor of government at Claremont McKenna College. Cesar's research sits at the intersection of political science, public health, and sociology. His research has been generously funded by institutions such as the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine through the Ford Dissertation Fellowship, the NIH Spectrum Grant, among other institutions. And Cesar obtained his PhD in political science from Stanford University. So let's kindly welcome Cesar to the stage for his talk.
I'll just wait for people to get their snacks. So caffeine and food makes a happier audience. Okay, let's get started. Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Thank you everyone as well for taking the time to be here to listen to my talk. I'm really excited to share with you guys the results of a paper that was a spin-off from one of my dissertation chapters, and I'm excited to hear your reactions and thoughts. So let's get to it. For those of you who have at one point filled out a US visa immigration form, a green card application, this question may be familiar. Have you ever been a member of or in any way affiliated with the Communist Party or another totalitarian party in the United States or abroad? Here, the US government is assessing to what extent the ideology of incoming arrivals is something that ought to matter and ought to be a variable that can exclude certain individuals from admission into the country. Now, this was started during the Cold War, fearing that the spread of communism would come into the country, but there's other instances of the United States government doing something similar. In the early 1900s, for instance, the US government barred individuals who had anarchist beliefs from admission into the country. And this leads to an interesting question of, well, to what extent does an immigrant's political ideology, their political beliefs, influence whether they ought to be admitted into the country or not? And this question has become increasingly pressing as the country becomes more and more polarized along political lines. Today, your political beliefs, your political attachments, your ideology have become a marker that signals a lot more than just whether you want low taxes or access to government welfare programs or public education. It's become a marker for a person's character among some individuals. And it's now influenced where you decide to live, who you decide to befriend, and even who you decide to marry. So when I was thinking over the role of political ideology in immigrant preferences, I started thinking about things like these. These are two individuals at a Trump rally a few years ago that have shirts saying, I would rather be a Russian, a member of a foreign adversary to the United States, than a Democrat, a member of a domestic political rival. They're in essence saying, I may not like X group, but I sure hate or dislike this other group more. This leads to my two research questions that I will address during the remainder of my talk. Can shared political ideology between immigrants and the public influence who we considered should be admitted into our borders? And similarly, if there is an effect, to what extent does coming in the right way, quote unquote, waiting your place in line, does that affect whether that value is the same, or if you come perhaps with authorization, does that premium ameliorate any penalty that might be assigned? So let's just review quickly the theory underpinning this paper. So when I looked at the theory of immigrant preferences and political science, it's sort of focused on two main opposing sides. One is the sociotropic factors. So the public wants more doctors, more nurses, engineers, highly skilled, highly educated immigrants, because they're gonna provide this net benefit to society. That's on one side. On the other side, there's egocentric concerns. Sure, we may want more doctors, or maybe we want more professors, but don't bring more professors that teach exactly government, because they're gonna compete with me for my job. Or maybe you don't want more doctors, more engineers, because you work at Meta, and having more engineers might suppress your wages, the pocketbook concerns. So for a long time, there was a debate in the literature between these two extremes, with Sameera and Hopkins in 2014 using a conjoint experiment to find that, by and large, the public prefers highly skilled, highly educated immigrants. But most of this literature focuses on immigrants with the traits that they have, with their professional traits and their cultural values. How many years of English do they have? What profession do they hold? Did they ever come to the US? What is their religion? How likely are they to merge culturally or professionally? But immigrants also have political attachments, and those political attachments may be the reasons why they decide to come to this country. Maybe they're living a socialist regime that has suppressed their views that are more conservative. Maybe it's the inverse. Maybe they're living a conservative regime because they hold more liberal progressive views. But none of that literature had addressed this, and I began to wonder, to what extent does this matter among Americans' mind when we're deciding who should come into our borders? And there's two reasons why I believe that political ideology may matter. So at its very core, Shared political ideology creates this sort of bond, this group identity, where the psychology literature has shown us that even sharing something small, perhaps insignificant, like sharing a birthday, creates a bond between two individuals that may make you more welcoming, a little friendlier towards that other person. Maybe you share the same hometown. Now, when it comes to political ideology, this can become increasingly powerful because political ideology, as I mentioned, in hyperpolarized times, can be a marker for character. So if I see another fellow conservative, another fellow liberal, it may give me a lot more information over what they believe than just other characteristics. And critically, in an era where the next election is the most pressing election, where elections are being decided by small margins, even if these immigrants cannot immediately vote, maybe they talk to a friend as a citizen and convince them like, hey, you should vote for this person. Maybe they they marry someone who's a citizen. Maybe they start become citizens themselves. So even if they cannot immediately vote and have an impact on electoral outcomes, their being in the country at some point may yield them the ability to have an impact on preferred political preferences. So what I sought to do was analyze this multiple ways, and the ethos of this paper is replication and extension. So in the first paper, I set a conjoint survey experiment of 3,000 respondents in 2022 using lucid theorem, and then I had another survey, this time using survey vignettes on a sample of 2,500 using YouGov in May of 2023. So let's begin discussing each of these in order. So for the first conjoint, what I did is I asked respondents to think of themselves as an immigration officer, tasked with approving or rejecting applications. So what I did is I provided them with a pair of profiles of immigrants with 7 traits about their background: their gender, the language, job experience, profession, origin, previous trips to the US, and the one I'm really interested in, political ideology. All the other sans political ideology have been tested by the literature, so it also serves as a gut check, right, to see to what extent are the results looking similar to what the previous literature has seen. And then I provided them with these pairs, and I had 6 pairs. That way we could get some good power out of it. This is sort of what the attributes and the values look like. So we have gender, language, job experience, profession, origin. And then here these are all randomized in order in the actual experiment. Here we have political ideology, but that's a little low for those in the back. I'm sorry about that. But it has 3 values. They're either liberal, explicit labels, conservative, explicit label, or it's also useful to know whether shared political ideology is a premium or whether opposing it is a penalty. Where is the direction of the effect going? We also have an NA, suggesting information is not available. So this is our control. I pre-register this, and then for today, I'm just showing you the forced choice. The favorability ones are the same, but it's just deciding between these 2 individuals, these 2 immigrants, which do you think should come into the US? So now let's go through the results. So here are the results for all of them. Hopefully it's good to see. It can get a little hard with the numbers being small, but so here we have the marginal means. In the y-axis, we have the immigrants' characteristics. And then we have in blue our liberal respondents, and in red our conservative respondents. And this sort of, from this second quarter all the way down, it mimics a lot the literature on Hyman and Hopkins and the like that find that the public still, 10 years later, prefers highly skilled, highly educated immigrants. A research scientist, fluent in English, with many years of experience, for instance, is favored a lot more. But let's look at the role of political ideology. When we see an immigrant, so when we see a respondent that's a liberal, I really wish that the laser worked because I wanted to point at things, but let's see if I can get a little taller. Okay, so when we see an immigrant who's a liberal, by a liberal respondent, there is a premium, okay? So liberals like liberal immigrants more. When the immigrant is a conservative, the conservative respondent also likes them more. So the premium is roughly in similar magnitudes. And this, if you kind of use the other ones as sort of your benchmark or comparison, it aligns as like being a teacher, computer programmer. Now let's look at the penalty. So if there's a liberal immigrant and you are, oh, there's a laser, awesome. I don't know where that laser came from. Oh, amazing, thank you. Okay. Gracias, gracias. Oh, see, this is great. Thank you. Okay, so if there's a liberal immigrant and you're a conservative, there is a really big penalty. And that penalty is just as big as if the immigrant were a janitor or a gardener. It's not just conservative respondents who are doing this. Liberal respondents are also putting a penalty when this immigrant is a conservative. This suggests that an immigrant's political ideology has an effect on who we consider ought to be coming into this country. So the results of this conjoint suggest that immigrants' ideology matters to liberals and conservatives, and that political ideology can serve as a premium and a penalty. Now, a conjoint is also not perfect, right? I'm providing them all the attributes. There's a lot more information there for them to see. I also, you may have noticed, I didn't include religion. And I didn't include religion for a big fear that I had, which is that a conservative Muslim may be seen very differently than a conservative Christian. And I was worried that those interactions may lead to funky results. So I excluded it. But it's important. It's a very important factor in who we allow into our country. So let's replicate the results of this conjoint, and let's extend them because we need a tenure packet. So what we're going to do is we're going to now use a vignette style study where we're going to introduce respondents to an immigrant seeking admission into the country. And we're going to focus on three main characteristics. Their ethnicity. So it's either going to be Roberto Hernandez, likely Latino, likely Catholic, or Mohammed Hussein, likely Middle Eastern, likely Muslim. And then in the conjuring, we had explicit labels of their political ideology. How about we stay away a bit from that and we just provide them with their policy preferences? They're either a strong opponent or a strong supporter of social welfare programs and gay marriage. And then lastly, there's been some literature that suggests that sometimes when we're assessing immigrants, having them participate in the community, being good sort of neighbors and engaging in charitable organizations, volunteering their time, can be a premium because they're seen as this philanthropic characteristic, right? Well, if they're doing that and they hold beliefs that we find not acceptable, we may not like that very much. So for the third is, okay, they're active or no mention of them volunteering community organizations. So let's look now at what the vignette is summarized. It looks a little long. There's also, I saw after I sent the slides that there's a typo which should say strong opponent and strong supporter. Let's just ignore it for now. But respondents were presented with the following prompt: Roberto Hernandez or Mohammed Hussein is applying to be admitted to the United States. Teacher in mid-30s, married but no children, and then they're interested in politics and are either a strong opponent or strong supporter of social welfare programs on gay marriage, and then either no mention or in his free time, active in community organizations and charities. So now we're going to ask respondents to what extent they would support giving a green card to an individual with these characteristics, with a 5-item likely range from 1, strongly support, to 0, strongly oppose. So the results, there's a lot, but we're going to unpack it together, so don't be too afraid when you see this next figure. Okay, so this is what it looks really nice in this projector. Great. Okay, so there's a lot here, but let's unpack it together, okay? So in the x-axis, we have the respondent's name, which is also a proxy for their ethnicity and religion. So Mohammed or Roberto or Mohammed. In the panels, we have whether they're active in community or no mention. Now, the red circles, the red point estimates are when their policy preferences of the immigrant. So red is when they are a strong opponent of social welfare and gay marriage. Blue is when they are supporters. And then from left to right is the respondent's political ideology. And with the y-axis, we have our outcome of interest. So there's two main results that I want to highlight here. When we look at liberal respondents, there is a gap in all of them between shared political ideology and those who oppose the respondent's ideology. So support from giving a green card is always higher when the immigrant is a supporter of welfare programs and gay marriage. In this case, we don't have a control, so we can't see to what extent there's a penalty, but we can see there's a gap. Similarly, liberals don't care whether you are Roberto, a Latino, or Mohammed. Those, if you look now horizontally, those are not significant from each other. So liberals don't care about immigrants' ethnicity or religion, but do care about their ideology. They also don't place a high value on community engagement. Conservatives follow something very similar. They also prefer or have higher favorability when the immigrant is like-minded. The one exception is that the premium for being like-minded goes or shrinks significantly when Mohammed is not active in his community. Nonetheless, you can see in all the other quadrants that there is a premium for being like-minded. So now we're seeing that this replicates largely what we see in the conjoint, with just a wrinkle on Mohammed when he's not active in the community. Okay, so overall in the conjoint and the vignette, we see that respondents are most supportive of a like-minded immigrant, independent of their origin and community engagement. But I wanted to know more, and I wanted to dig deeper. And something struck me that's been going on in political rhetoric that's, okay, well, if you come into this country, your first move cannot be to, quote unquote, break the law. So I started wondering about that, and I thought, okay, well, suppose that you do come into this country without authorization, but you are fleeing a socialist regime and you are conservative. Would conservatives, would that penalty that they assign to your behavior be ameliorated by that? Or would they say, well, you know, like you're doing something that you need to do? So what I'm going to explore now is to what extent is the effect of shared political beliefs conditional on an immigrant's legal status or, quote unquote, arriving the right way? So what I sought to do was I introduced respondents to an immigrant family. And they're seeking to relocate to the respondent's community. The family arrived in the US, fleeing political persecution in the country, and what we're going to do is we're going to randomize 2 traits about them. We're going to randomize the parents' legal status, they're either undocumented or not, and their political ideology. They're either going to be liberal or conservative. So they're fleeing for being persecuted for holding these beliefs. Very common in our nation's history. So this is what the vignette looks like. Let me tell you about a family of 4 planning to move to your community. The parents, no mention, or I wanted to be very explicit and not prevent any service satisfying. So I put illegal immigrants, run their own gardening business, and their children speak multiple languages. The family came to the US 30 years ago after being arrested for holding liberal or conservative political beliefs in their home country. Now, for my outcome, I wanted to focus on an intuition that I had, which is that if it matters for political ideology with immigrants coming into the country, then I believe that it ought to matter for where the country is if these immigrants are living here. So to what extent do you think is the US better off when families like these come to live here? And I measure responses using a 5-element Likert going from they agree that it's better off to 0 strongly disagree. So now what is the impact of coming into this country, perhaps breaking an immigration law, but you might share the ideology of the respondent? Here are the results. In the x-axis, we have whether the immigrants are no mention or unauthorized. Similar to earlier, the parents are, when they're conservative, are in red. When the parents are liberal, it's in blue. The facets are the respondent's political ideology, and the y-axis is our outcome of interest. And there's 3 main takeaways from this figure. The first is that liberals do not place high value on whether the immigrants are authorized or not. Those 2 are consistent with each other, not significant from each other. But they do place high value if the immigrant is, or the parents are liberals or conservative. So when they fled because of their liberal beliefs, they are seen as the country being much better off with them here than when these immigrants are conservative. So liberals care about the political ideology of these individuals. Conservatives do too, but they care about authorized status and political ideology. So when the family has no mention of legal status and their conservative support is quite high. But when the family is liberal and undocumented, support is much lower. And third, and I think this was one of the most shocking, is that these two are not significant from each other, suggesting that conservatives, the penalty that they assign for a family being liberal, so this sort of out-group animosity, is sort of, and you end up in the same place as a family that's unauthorized, but that shares your political beliefs, suggesting that you could come into this country with authorization, and that might, in the eyes of some individuals, be seen as equal, as a country being equally good in the future than if you came through regular means, but you were a liberal individual. Now, no scientific paper is perfect. Mine is no exception. In this paper, for instance, the policy preferences I chose are just 2 out of countless number of other ones that I could have chosen. And they're both also aligned. I didn't choose anything in the offsets. That requires a bit more digging into. The family also holds ideal traits. This family of immigrants who run their own gardening business and their children speak multiple languages sounds like a pretty cool family. I would need to see to what extent this effect remains the same if this family maybe don't have their own business, maybe they're struggling to make ends meet, maybe there's something else that makes them a little less ideal. And then lastly, this is what I'm working on now, which is that this shows you that the political ideology matters for assessments over immigrants, both with them coming, being admitted, and also with the country being better off with them here. The next step for me is to explore to what extent does this change attitudes towards immigration reform or policies that benefit these communities. If these individuals are very conservative and they would say absolutely not because so-and-so says they're going to vote Democrat, but you tell them, well, they may not because X, Y, and Z, does that change the way that they view immigration policy, immigration reform, changes to benefits to this population? But all in all, I find here that political ideology matters for immigration preferences and that political ideology, the benefit of it is not conditional on legal status. And that's all that I have for you guys today. Thank you so much. That email still works. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you for the presentation. It was crystal clear, I have to say.
Oh, thank you.
It's really easy to follow. I have a question because I'm actually rather surprised that the base rate of acceptance of immigrants is quite high. It's in general quite above 50% across all the political, ideology you've mentioned. But I was wondering, I'm curious, do you happen to know if like any other demographic from respondents could predict like lower acceptance rates? Because maybe other things other than like being liberal, conservative could predict like someone who's like extremely hardcore against any sort of like immigration and yeah.
Do you mean for the conjoint or the vignette? Which one are you?
I'm talking about the last 2 studies where like basically all estimates were mostly above 50%, like any plot says like the overall support is between 60 to 80%. And yeah, that was the surprising fact to me.
Yeah, I mean, I haven't unpacked so much the lowest bound. What I do know are 2 things. One is that in as much as rhetoric suggests that we're very polarized on immigration and some folks absolutely do not want to, there's actually quite a bit of support for immigrants and immigration in this country, and it follows the ethos of the country. I think what you're hinting at is that these are this is like your really ideal immigrant, right? Like mid-30s, kind of like works, they seem, other than political ideology, seem like a good person. So this might be more of like a ceiling, these results, that if I were to say maybe not a teacher, think of your other profession, or maybe not mid-30s, married with no children, maybe they have a big family, maybe they're divorced and have 2 big families. I can see that going much lower. So I haven't quite unpacked it to see which groups might not love this person, but my sense is that based on what I've seen, it wouldn't be surprising to get somewhere like around the 40%, but I can see this also going much lower if I start tinkering with the characteristics. Thank you.
So I thought this was really interesting, and I was wondering the degree to which this is about or the responses are getting at immigration rather than just being in the community of some kind. So having something similar where it's, an immigration case crossed against like someone joining your co-op or your HOA or your firm or something like that. And whether you're just tracking people's groupiness as opposed to groupiness plus immigration.
Yeah, the mechanisms is something that I'm working through unpacking. So for instance, in this case, you're right, like one of the things that could be working here is animosity or favorability towards your group. So you kind of see this and you're like, okay, well this person is part of the tent, so we like them. Which that would suggest that would be actually a very interesting finding, because it would suggest that groups traditionally seen as outsiders, immigrants, can be brought into the tent. So this follows that T-shirt figure where I would rather be a Russian than a Democrat. Like, I dislike Democrats more than I dislike maybe this other group. Or it could be an electoral mechanism where it's like, okay, these folks at some point might push policies that I also favor. I'm not showing here in this main presentation, and I can try and get into the appendix to some of the measures that I tried testing, but I find that it's mainly people who really don't like the out group that push the values much higher. So liberals who really don't like conservatives and conservatives who really don't like liberals, that's where you really see the effects kick in. Let me see if, oh, this is AMCEs, hopefully. Nope, that's not. I should have fixed the buttons last night, but it was a long flight. If you email me, I have the results. Liberal strength, oh, here it is. Okay, yeah, so here you have individuals, oh, this is not the one I wanted. Okay, yeah, just email me, I'll find it for you. It's in here. But I find that it's more like an animosity story rather than a practical one. And that's part of it, but it's kind of interesting, right? That like, groups traditionally outsiders are now being brought into the tent. I'll send you that figure. Send me an email.
Thank you so much. My question is somewhat related to y'all's questions, which is thinking about, you mentioned that you had specifically said illegal immigrant in the blurb did you say that was to reduce, like, just performative responding? Was that, okay. I'm wondering if, because this was this YouGov? What was the sample?
The second one, yes.
Do you have, like, location data or some other metric of how frequently the people in your study actually come in contact with people who have immigrated? Because I'm wondering if you would find, right, you could explore, is this actually, is this actually symbolic responding? By looking at the people who, it's really unlikely they have actual real world responses, I would expect then that you would see even greater difference between liberal and conservatives because they are just signaling, right?
Right.
Compared to people who actually have actual experience where they're like, oh, I know that this is like a nuanced issue and I'm not just going to say 10 or 0. Do you have that? Is that something you could look at?
I could look at the location data. I don't know how granular it goes. I think maybe zip code might be the smallest. I need to double check. So I could look to see maybe there's variation in some places. The goal is always that hopefully randomization kind of deals with any of those potential variables, and that's why we love random.
Oh yeah, I don't think it's a confound. I actually think it's something that you could just look into to explore. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, thank you. Yeah, that'd be super interesting. Hopefully I do. If not, tenure packet, right? So
there you go.
Next paper.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. I was wondering, your presentation was fantastic, but it brought up a lot of thoughts specifically related to Trump's comments about Haitian immigrants in Springfield, Ohio, and when they conducted surveys of people actually in Springfield, Ohio, besides the kind of ridiculous comments about eating pets, they were talking specifically about kind of the pressures put on housing and putting on healthcare costs, social housing, and I was wondering, did you explore any kind of comments or kind of vignettes related to whether or not said immigrant would take use of these social services, just because if an immigrant does come from a conservative household or conservative background, that doesn't mean they wouldn't engage in kind of the use of social services because human needs are human needs. So I was just wondering about that.
That's a really interesting point. So in this conjoint, not in the vignette, in the conjoint, I had a follow-up question that is a paper that I still need to write, maybe on the flight home, that I randomized, suppose this immigrant lost their job and they needed employment benefits, or suppose this immigrant fell ill and they needed government healthcare programs. Would you support them getting access to this? So, and the results largely look like this. There's some variance in whether the professions and the other ones play a role. So I see still having an effect, not nearly as big as the admission, which suggests another bucket of things. I'm still trying to mull over what the story is that I'm going to tell. But you're absolutely right. Like, once they come in, they may need resources. To what extent does shared political ideology moderate your willingness to provide them? And I think that's something that remains on, we still do more work to answer adequately. We'll see how that other paper goes when I start writing it, but I'm really interested in finding that out. So hey, if you want to write a paper, let me know.
Yeah, thank you so much for your presentation. I really appreciate it. I really like how you build on pretty much the common in-group identity model. And I have a few questions pretty much from other research that has also used this model, right? There's usually unstable effects in the sense that they don't last very long. And in addition to that, there also tends to be followed up by some form of backlash because people end up subgrouping the outgroup, right? So I'm just wondering if, in the future, are you also interested in looking at these ideas of, this immigrant is sharing my party, my ideology, why aren't all these other immigrants not doing so? So I'm going to backlash against all these other immigrants and, support them even less, in a sense, right?
You're absolutely right. This is a snapshot in time using an online sort of response. And the effects could have gone out the door the moment that they turned away from their screen. That's absolutely, that's a worry, and that's something that we have to grapple with as survey researchers. And it's a limitation that we don't have a perfect solution for now. I would love to run a panel, something similar to this, where I can test in multiple waves how long these things last. My intuition, though, however, given that we ran it twice, well, I ran it twice, and then I got the same results again, is that in as much as maybe the effect is being triggered or salient when the survey comes up, I don't think it's sort of disappearing altogether. And that's sort of based on this, that we have two surveys at multiple periods, you still see those effects, whereas if the magnitude changes from 9 to 7 or whatever it may be, that's a question that can be another paper, but for now, it's sort of reassuring that it remains there. But it would be great to see a panel where maybe, let's say somebody switches their political ideology. They move here, and you know what, they fled a socialist regime, but now they kind of like socialism. Do you still like this person, or do you still support them? I mean, that would be the sort of thing that I think would be, we still don't know how much that changes if these individuals changes their ideology. So that's something that I can work on, but thank you.
Thank you so much, great talk, and I hope this nicely contributes to the tenure. One question I can't wrap my head around is that conservatives tend to agree with allowing other conservatives in the country. Because, yes, they are also conservative, but how they practice conservatism looks very different from where they came from. And my initial explanation that you nicely also showed was this T-shirt, that people just don't understand what that means, being conservative in a different country. So do you have any controlling variable in your model that could explain this? I know you have education there, but maybe something else that could help disentangle this conservatism.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that could be going on with the T-shirt thing. There's a lot of things going on there. But you're right, like conservatism here may be very different than Western Europe, maybe very different in Latin America. Liberal, for instance, can also change that. My goal is hopefully, because I'm priming them and giving them sort of like, this is what they hold, without the other bucket of ideologies that can kind of go around it. which is one solution to it. The other one is that I have sort of like the individuals who are sorted or not sorted. So if you're a liberal and you're also a Democrat versus you're a Republican and a conservative, so you kind of know what the party stands for. And you kind of see very similar effects where if you are, this kind of, hopefully I don't know if it's hard to see, but if you are sorted, you still have effects. If you're not, the effects shrink, but they're still somewhat there. So for instance, if you're a liberal and a Democrat, or if you're conservative and not Republican, then there's still some effects there. I mean, like it kind of closes, it narrows in, but it's still present. But I mean, it'd be great to sort of do something where I give them different values. Like, is it the policy on welfare and same-sex marriage, or is it something else? Like, environment, would that have the same effect? Religion, I mean, you name it. So that would be interesting to test.
Yes, thank you.
Hi, thanks. Well, I had a very similar kind of question. Essentially, that this discrimination between conservative and liberals is very U.S.-centric, and in other countries you have like a lot of different mixtures. Essentially, putting together gay marriage and social welfare is very relatively common here, but it's not very common in other places. So maybe thinking about how you're breaking up these assumptions or testing very specific things could be, again, like this idea of like someone is being held in a conservative in a liberal country because of their conservative beliefs is not that common, but the other one being held in a conservative country or authoritarian country because of their liberal beliefs is a bit more common, right? I cannot think about examples of like liberals holding up conservatives. So again, like these, you have these commentaries because it's very nice for experimental design, but it's not sure that it really represents what's going on in the world. So just thinking about how breaking up these things will be interesting.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is very US-centric. So it'd be great to do something out in the world. I think it's just, I mean, we could think of maybe like the United Kingdom or some of these other polarized settings where this might apply with different examples. But it'd be very interesting to see how that pans out there, because we have a very unique system where two parties are sort of your menu of choice. But yeah, this is tenure packet, right? So that's what we need.
Thank you again so much, Cesar. And as we have a little bit of a reshuffle in the room, let me bring up our next and final presentation for today. All right, here we go. So today is a half day. The first day of the conference is a half day. We're going to wrap up with this talk. So last but not least, let me introduce Dr. Giulia Maimone. Giulia is a postdoctoral scholar in the Behavioral Decision-Making Group at the Anderson School of Management at UCLA. She received her PhD in marketing from the Rady School of Management at UCSD. Her research focuses on consumer judgment and decision-making, and she's particularly interested in understanding how and why the consideration of negative and ambiguous information influences individuals' judgments, preferences, and behaviors. So without further ado, I hand it over to Giulia.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm really excited to present this project to you today that is shared work with my amazing co-author, Craig McKenzie. And if that's okay with the room, I would take all the questions in the end. Thank you. So, as you in this room know better than anyone else probably, we live in an extremely polarized society. And while there is quite a bit of research about how people on the opposite sides of the political spectrum view and judge each other, there is surprisingly little research about how these people, the partisan people, view and judge moderates. But what do I mean by moderates? By moderates, I mean people who do disclose a genuinely non-extreme position. And the question we're really asking in this paper is, do moderates please all sides or please no side? And we predict that the latter is true, and moderates please no side. More specifically, we predict that people holding a partisan view on a socio-political issue systematically categorize moderates as outgroup members, regardless of what side they're on, and we call this the moderate as outgroup effect. So let's take abortion for an example. Imagine there are 3 people. One is pro-life, one is pro-choice, and then there is Jamie, who is moderate. And we predict that the pro-life person would judge Jamie to be pro-choice, and at the same time, the pro-choice person would judge Jamie to be pro-life. In other words, the same moderate target is going to be judged as belonging to opposing groups depending on the side of the judge. And so to test this, we ran an abortion study. First of all, we asked participants about their position on abortion, from I'm definitely pro-life to I'm definitely pro-choice. And this was the distribution of responses, not surprisingly, as we ran the study on prolific. And then we asked participants to evaluate 11 policies on abortion for non-medical reasons, from abortion never allowed, abortion allowed up to 4 weeks from conception, 8 weeks, 12 weeks, 16 weeks, increments of 4 weeks up until abortion always allowed. And we asked all participants to judge each policy on whether they thought each policy is definitely pro-life to definitely pro-choice, where 0 is neither pro-life nor pro-choice. And we pre-registered that in the main analysis, we would look at the judgments of 3 groups of participants. Participants who are pro-life, neither pro-life nor pro-choice, and pro-choice. And I just told you earlier that we collected participants' views on abortion. And so in this study, we collapsed the more and less extreme views on the same side in the same group. So people who were definitely pro-life and mostly pro-life here are together in the pro-life group, and mostly pro-choice and definitely pro-choice are together here. And so at this point, we really had a pretty difficult question to answer. That is, what is a moderate policy on abortion? And this proved to be a little harder than expected. And so to do that, we pre-registered that we would look at the responses of the non-partisan people who are neither pro-life nor pro-choice. And we did that because if there is a partisan bias in judging these policies, hopefully non-partisan participants should not exhibit such partisan bias. And these were the responses. And we see that these people identified 3 policies as moderate. Abortion allowed up to 4 weeks from conception, 8 weeks, and 12 weeks. And in fact, their judgments of these 3 policies are non-significantly different from 0, neither pro-life nor pro-choice. And in retrospect, we think that considering these 3 policies as moderate makes sense, because if we take the timeline of a pregnancy, we see that these 3 policies all fall within the first trimester of the pregnancy, when the future baby is still an embryo, not a fetus yet. And also, if we consider all the countries in the world that do allow abortion for non-medical reasons, we see that the majority of these countries allow abortion for non-medical reasons up until 12 weeks from conception. And so we thought it makes sense to consider anything within that range as moderate. All right, let's take a look at the responses of the partisan people. So the very first thing I want you to notice is that the judgments of these people were the same. These people agreed only in judging abortion never allowed and abortion always allowed. And they judged every other policy differently from each other. Even abortion allowed up to 36 weeks was judged differently by pro-life and pro-choice people. But more importantly for our hypothesis, if we look at the 3 moderate policies, we see that the pro-life people judge these 3 policies to be pro-choice. In fact, these 3 red dots are significantly greater than 0. And at the same time, the pro-choice participants judge the same 3 policies to be pro-life. And in fact, the blue dots are significantly lower than 0. In other words, we see evidence for the moderate as outgroup effect, where participants judge the moderate policies to belong at the outgroup ideology, regardless of what side they were on. So at this point, you can say, okay, Giulia, but these were judgments of policies. Your hypothesis was about judgment of moderate people. What about moderate people? And so we replicated this experiment using the exact same setup, except we as participants, instead of judging the policies, the 11 policies, we asked them to judge a person, Jamie, who supports each policy one at a time, on whether Jamie is pro-life or pro-choice. And we see that we almost perfectly replicate the pattern from the previous study. Non-partisan people identified the same 3 policies to be moderate. Again, the partisan people judged Jamie in the same way, only when they supported abortion never allowed and abortion always allowed, and judged Jamie differently across the entire spectrum of policies. And for the 3 moderate policies, again, pro-choice participants judged Jamie to be pro-life when they supported the moderate policies, and pro-life participants judged Jamie to be pro-choice for 2 of the 3 moderate policies. And so at this point, we wanted to explore a little bit whether this effect always occurs or it has boundary conditions. And we predicted that we would find the moderate as outgroup effect over moralized issues, but not over non-moralized issues. For example, taste-based issues. And so to test this, we ran a Trump study. We first asked participants their political orientation from I'm very conservative to I'm very liberal. And once again, we looked at 3 groups, the 2 partisan groups and the non-partisan one. And then we asked them to evaluate 7 positions on supporting or opposing Trump's politics, from completely oppose Trump politics to completely support Trump politics, where the midpoint of this bipolar scale is mixed opinions about Trump politics. And then we asked them to imagine 7 people who express their position on Trump's politics, picking every single point of the scale. And then we asked them whether they thought these hypothetical targets were definitely definitely conservative to definitely liberal. And here I want you to notice that for RDV, we used the 5-point bipolar scale. And that's because our IV is already a 7-point bipolar scale. And so we just wanted to make it a little harder for participants to simply track the IV onto the DV. However, our point of interest, that is 0 mixed opinions about Trump politics, is super easy to track. And finally, we asked participants whether they thought that supporting or opposing Trump politics is a matter of morality or a matter of political taste. Again, on a bipolar scale, from entirely a matter of morality to entirely a matter of political scale, where the midpoint is equally a matter of morality and of political taste. And we predicted that viewing the issue as a matter of morality predicts an increased likelihood to judge moderates as belonging to the outgroup. And so to do that, we first recategorize our dependent variable, that I remind you was target is definitely conservative to definitely liberal, based on each participant's side. So that the new DV is target is on my same side, so is an in-group, or target is on the opposing side, so is an out-group. And we regressed this new variable on whether participants view the issue to be a matter of morality or of political taste. As predicted, we find that viewing the issue as a matter of morality significantly predicts an increased likelihood to judge a moderate target as an out-group member. And this effect goes away as we move to seeing the issue as a matter of political taste. So at this point, we wanted to dig a little bit more into what is the psychological driver of this effect, what is causing the effect. And we predicted that what's causing the effect is the perception that the moderate target agrees with the opposing immoral ideology, more than disagrees with one's own moral side. And that's because people are especially aversive to other people agreeing with someone or something that's immoral for them. And so to study this, we ran an Israel-Palestine study. And I want you to notice, sorry, that we ran this study on November 14th, 2023, so roughly a month after the infamous October 7 attacks. And we first asked participants their position on the conflict, so whether they were definitely pro-Israel to definitely pro-Palestine. And once again, we looked at 3 main groups. And then we asked participants to judge a person, Jamie, who supports one of 3 positions on the conflict. One position that's definitely pro-Israel, one that's definitely pro-Palestine, and the moderate one. And then we asked them to judge Jamie on whether they think Jamie is definitely pro-Israel to definitely pro-Palestine, based on which position they support. But more importantly, in this study, we manipulated the framing of the moderate option. In one condition, we framed the moderate option as pro both sides, so agreeing with both sides. In the other condition, we framed it as agreeing with neither side, so disagreeing with both sides. And we predicted that because participants are particularly aversive to someone agreeing with the opposing side, we would replicate the moderate as outgroup effect when the moderate option is framed as pro both sides, but the effect would be moderated when the moderate option is framed as pro neither side, because I don't care that much that you disagree with me as long as you don't agree with the opposing side. To the results, once again, we do replicate the moderate as outgroup effect when the moderate option is expressed as pro both sides. Pro-Israel participants judge Jamie to be pro-Palestine, and pro-Palestine participants judge Jamie to be pro-Israel. This is actually significantly lower than 0. And more importantly, the effect completely went away when the moderate option was framed as pro-neither side. So we think this is pretty good evidence about the fact that perceiving that the moderate agrees with the outgroup is driving the effect. However, we consider 2 other potential alternative explanations for this effect. One is that partisan people might actually have a biased definition of moderate, and specifically that they might think of themselves as moderates. And so if someone is more moderate than them, is a true moderate, they must fall on the other side because I'm already a moderate. The other is a sort of echo chamber explanation, where if I am pro-Israel, I probably tend to surround myself with other pro-Israel people, and I might think that I might tend to have a biased distribution of what the population looks like, of what the opinion in the population looks like. And so when someone is a moderate, is such a far position from everyone I'm surrounded by that they must be falling on the tail of the distribution. So they must be on the other side. However, we ruled out both of these alternative explanations because we think there's no way in which either of these could explain the results from the Israel-Palestine study. In other words, simply just by framing the moderate option as pro neither side, it shouldn't change how I perceive myself or my distribution in the population. So at this point, you may wonder whether the judge's extremity matters, right? Attitude extremity, if you want. And the answer is absolutely yes. So these are the 4 experiments I showed you so far, but instead of breaking down the results by 3 groups, I broke them by all 5 groups that we collected. So the more and less extreme partisan sides, the non-partisan one, and the more and less extreme partisans on the other side. So in the abortion studies, we see that definitely pro-life people were the ones that gave the most pro-choice judgments in both studies. And the definitely pro-choice participants were the ones that gave the most pro-life answers in both studies. You see the moderate subgroup effect in the pro-Israel-Palestine study is almost entirely driven by people who were definitely the hold more extreme positions, so definitely pro-Israel, definitely pro-Palestine. And even in the Trump study, it was driven by the more extreme people. So what we know so far, we know that a moderate outgroup effect exists regardless of what side participants are on. We know that it is driven by people perceiving that the moderate agrees with the immoral side. And we know that it exists for moralized issues, but not for taste-based issues or non-moral issues. What we do not know yet is whether moralization is enough to produce the moderate subgroup effect, or does the moral issue needs to be also polarizing. And so we predicted that it does, that it would need to be also polarizing. And now I'm going to show you this data I basically collected on the plane coming here. So super fresh data. And I would love to have you help me also make sense of it. So first of all, I ran a pretest in which I pretested 3 issues on gender-affirming rights for transsexual individuals. I first asked participants their position on the issue from I'm definitely anti to definitely pro gender-affirming rights. And then we asked participants, this is just the pretest, their own position on these 3 issues. The first is including trans athletes in female competition, from completely oppose including trans athletes in female competition to completely support it. The second one is granting trans people access to gender-affirming health care, from the completely oppose to completely support. And the last one is completely oppose granting trans people basic rights that others have, to completely support granting trans people special privileges that others don't have. And our rationale for asking these 3 questions was that we hypothesized that the first 2 would be polarizing, so most people in the 2 groups would be at the extremes, but the third one would be non-polarizing. And in fact, we thought maybe the majority of people don't agree with either side, and most people should fall in the middle. So this should be non-polarizing. But we sort of assumed that all 3 were moral issues. So let's get to the data. So as for the trans athletes in female competition, we see that this is an extremely polarizing issue for people who are anti-gender-affirming rights. And kind of surprisingly to me, it's not polarizing at all for people who are pro. Actually, it's pretty evenly distributed, but most people fell in the middle. Gender-affirming healthcare instead is polarizing for both groups. Most people were at the extremes. And also, as predicted, the rights versus privileges issue was non-polarizing for either group. In fact, most people also fell in the middle. So given this, we predicted that we would find the moderate subgroup effect for pro-gender-affirming rights people only over the gender-affirming healthcare issue, because it's the only one where the blue people are polarized on. And that for people who are anti-gender-affirming rights, we would find it for the gender-affirming healthcare and the trans athletes in female competition, because it's the one where the red people are polarized. And we would not find it for either group for the rights versus privilege issue. Make sense? Okay, so we then ran the study while I was on the airplane. And once again, we asked participants about their position on the issue, whether they are definitely anti to definitely pro gender-affirming rights. And then we, similar to the Trump study, we asked them to evaluate 7 people from our pretest who picked each point of the scale. And so each person judged 3 people, so all the positions, but only within one issue. So the issue was between subjects. And we asked them to judge these people who picked each point of the scale on whether they thought the person is definitely anti-gender affirming rights to definitely pro-gender affirming rights. Once again, we had a 5-point scale instead of 7 for obvious reasons. And once again, our point of interest is the mixed opinion point. And once again, it's super easy to track. To the data, finally. So once again, what we're interested in is the mixed opinions. Okay? And let's start from the pro-gender affirming rights participants. I remind you, we hypothesized that we would find the moderate outgroup effect only over the gender-affirming healthcare, because it's the only one where they were polarized, and not for the other two issues. And that's exactly what we found. There was these 2 points here and there are not significantly different from 0, but this one here actually is. So people who are pro-gender affirming rights judged a person who has mixed opinion on gender-affirming healthcare as being anti-gender-affirming rights. Of course, the estimate is not very large, the difference in estimates, because it's so easy to track, but it is very significant. The error bars are very short. All right, so let's now take a look. So from this looks like polarization matters, right? Let's look at the anti-gender affirming rights people. As predicted, we found no effect whatsoever for the non-polarizing issue, once again, but they were flat all over. We did not find that they exhibited the moderate outgroup effect, and I'm honestly not sure why, so please help me. These were the complete data in case you're curious. So we actually see that the anti-people judged the target to be more pro gender-affirming rights when they were mildly pro. I don't know if that matters at all or not. But basically, I'm sure that I accidentally manipulated something I didn't mean to with this issue. And I have a few hypotheses here. One is that in this study is the only study where instead of having 2 groups that were pro something, I had one group that was pro trans rights and one that was anti. And so maybe being anti something makes you less likely to identify as a group. And so you don't really exhibit the moderate outgroup effect, which could be related to the concept of harm, right? I'm trying to protect someone versus harming someone. We know it's a big deal in moral psychology. Or maybe is how we conceptualize polarization, right? Because we conceptualize polarization as a distribution of opinions, which is what other papers in the literature have done. But maybe we should think about it more in the morally polarized sense. So maybe something that's uncompromisable, more like a sacred value. All right. I would love to hear all your comments and thoughts and everything. If you have questions or ideas that you don't want to share, please send me an email. Thank you so much. Yes. Anyone?
Okay, so thank you for a very interesting presentation.
Thank you.
I don't know if this idea fits your data at all, but I had in mind while you were talking a somewhat different interpretation of why people seem to dislike the moderates, and that is if there is an issue that you feel strongly morally about, then being a moderate would be somebody who are indifferent to something really wrong that is going on, right? So if, for example, in pre-war Germany, I was opposed to the Nazi party, and somebody told me that I don't really have a strong position on this, I would find that immoral, right?
Definitely. Definitely, and there is also a really nice paper on this showing that people who do not care about issues that we think are moral issues or important issue makes us not like them at all, which I totally relate. But I think that in this, how we conceptualize moderates is very specific, right? For example, you can think about the abortion study. Like being moderate means to support abortion allowed up to 8 weeks or 12 weeks. That doesn't necessarily mean you don't care about the issue, right? So it might be a concern for where I looked at the moderate option as mixed opinions. It's like maybe they're just lazy. They do not want to pick a side. They just put mixed opinion because they don't care. But I think in the other studies, also the Israel-Palestine one, it was pretty clear that the person had a genuine position. It was just a non-extreme one. Make sense?
Hi. Thank you for the great presentation. I really enjoyed all the things that you said. So one thing kept popping up in my head as you presented different cases is the idea of, there are some cases that involve more facts, like scientific facts, whereas other things that are more purely moral, I guess, right? So as you said, the abortion case, some people might conceive that as a completely moral thing, whereas other people would say, what are the scientific facts behind when a baby starts to feel something or something like that, right? So there are, people who try to find facts, whereas other people who have beliefs, right? I'm not sure how you can distinguish the two, but same thing with the Israel case. Some people might say, who started it? Whereas, other people will say, that's a genocide, it's just bad, right? So I just wonder whether some of the cases you present them as moral cases, but what if the respondents don't find them to be completely moral? Does that make sense?
So let me rephrase what you just said. Maybe I understood it wrong. Basically, what you're saying is, by purely moral, you mean almost like a religious belief, right? Like we should not kill babies, and therefore we should not have abortion, period. Versus based on like scientific evidence, like until X weeks, the baby doesn't feel anything if we...
Yeah, so some people would say abortion is good or abortion is bad because I believe it is bad. Whereas other people might want to think of it more in terms of like, when do they start feeling or something.
So I believe that is definitely true, and I think now it's kind of too late for me to go back to the results, but you see it from my data. Because if you see the responses of the pro-life participants, they are really like, for them, only abortion never allowed is pro-life. Everything else is pro-choice. Even 4 weeks, which most women don't even know they're pregnant at 4 weeks, is pro-choice for them, right? So you clearly see it's an all or nothing type of thinking, probably based on, like what you called like purely moral belief. And instead, pro-choice participants were more linear in their judgments, right? So in the first study, they crossed the neither pro-life nor pro-choice line at 20 weeks. So maybe there's something about 20 weeks. And so I share your intuition. But also, I think that probably for my effect, that doesn't really matter. Like, it doesn't really matter what causes your moral beliefs. As long as you think it's a moral thing, then you would exhibit this moderate as outgroup effect. Makes sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Ken. So thank you so much for your talk. I just wanted to say that I think like the last observation that you shared for the gender affirming situation is not a problem. It's a virtue of your finding. And what I'm thinking is that like for other cases, you are looking at like kind of symmetrical distribution of advocates for both sides in terms of size and like political power and organization. But for the trans rights, it's not asymmetrical. And when it's not asymmetrical, this smaller group has to rely on other kind of like social mechanisms to like keep the momentum and like the I don't know, like pressure that it can like be relevant in still the social discussions. And moralization is like a very strong, helpful effect. So in many other social situations, when you have this kind of asymmetry and a smaller group has to fight a bigger, more like dominant group, I think you would see similar kind of effects.
Thank you, I love that. I'll definitely post-test it.
Here, I have the mic over here.
Oh, sorry. Sorry.
Thanks for presenting this. I thought this was a really novel set of designs and very cool data. I think my question is similar to the first question, and it's about, I'll tie it to the sub-hypothesis about, do I make moderates the outgroup because I think they disagree with me or because I think they agree with the other group? I think I had the opposite intuition of your hypothesis, where I would have guessed it was, I'm categorizing them as agreeing with the outgroup. And when I saw the abortion graphs, I kind of came up with the story that seemed to say to me was if I'm moralized and pro-choice, I have a really high threshold of what counts as pro-choice. And if you don't meet this high threshold, then you're pro-life, and vice versa. If I'm moralized and pro-life, I have a really high threshold, like sort of a no exceptions policy about this. And so if you deviate at all, then I'm categorizing you as pro-choice. So based on that, I was curious, I guess I kind of wanted to hear again, what was the justification for the other hypothesis, which was the one you and your co-authors were more advocating for, that it's that you're categorizing them as disagreeing with me?
So thank you so much. I actually think that we are saying exactly what you are saying. Okay. So basically, when the moderate option is framed in a policy, as a policy, right? So it's not explicitly saying I agree with both or I disagree with both. It's just saying I think that we should have abortion until 8 weeks, and that's it. Because people do exactly what you're saying, they have a very high threshold, and therefore if someone is not agreeing to them to the extent of that threshold, they automatically categorize them as outgroups. So they think that they agree with the opposing side, right? If I am super pro-life and I think abortion should never, even at 1 day, never happen, if you agree with abortion allowed up to 8 weeks, then you must be pro-choice, right? Because it's exactly what you're saying. And the moderation we find is actually in the same direction. So when the moderate option is framed as agreeing with both, we find the moderate as outgroup effect because okay, it's fine you agree with me, but it's outrageous you agree with the opposing side. But when the moderate option is framed as pro-neither, so you do not agree with me, I don't care about that much as long as you don't agree with the opposing side. Which I think in the case like abortion, people automatically do the first, like the pro-both.
Thank you, that makes sense.
Okay.
I'll make real quick. I'm wondering if you could come up with a similar story for the other bucket, but.
I think I have been thinking about this a lot actually in relation to the last study, and when the issue was non-polarizing, right? The trans people should not have basic rights that others have or should have special privileges that others don't have, right? There, I think the moderate option means pro-neither, right? If you are in the middle on that issue, it's because you probably don't agree with either side. And so maybe that's also why we don't, we predicted we would not find an effect there, because people there automatically do the pro-neither reasoning instead of the pro-both. Make sense?
Yeah.
Oh.
So thank you for your very interesting talk. I have yet another interpretation of these results. What if, I don't know if you have any data on this, but what if I see moderates as someone who's not brave enough to take a stance? Okay. What if I can't decide, I'm not able to actually side on the right side of the story because I don't know, it's too risky. I don't know. Or what if I can't make it? I'm too simple for that. I don't know. Have you thoughts on this?
I think similarly to what I responded initially, I think that might be a potential interpretation for the studies where the moderate option is expressed at 0. I have mixed opinions, I don't really know what to pick, and therefore I'll just fall in the middle. But for example, in the abortion study, where you think that abortion should be allowed up to 12 weeks, I don't think that someone that tells me, I think abortion should be happening before 12 weeks is necessarily like someone that doesn't want to take a stand, right? They are taking a stand. It's just a non-extreme one. Make sense?
Thank you. I was wondering if there's another mechanism against moderates, which could be like when moderates are like powerful in an election. In a close election, moderates are probably the ones who like define the election. Mm-hmm. I'm thinking of, I don't know, in swing states, probably moderates are much more powerful electorally than in states where obviously the Democrats or the Republicans will win. So maybe you could try to test like in swing states versus other states, whereas like this moderate as outgroup effect. Because if you, in a close election, a moderate is making the other side win. So I don't know, that could be another mechanism.
Yeah, I think that's super interesting, and it would be great to test. Like a high-level answer to that is that I think that this effect is probably like a little bit contributing to polarization itself, right? So you see in the abortion studies, I had 800 participants and 26 people who were neither pro-life nor pro-choice, right? So if it's true that people do not like moderates on moralized issues, and potentially moderates realize that, and over time they tend to pick a side. And so like this effect might contribute to increasing polarization. And so that makes me think like if there is an issue where there are lots of moderates, is that really a moralized issue? Because we know moral issues are very, very polarizing usually. So I think it would be super interesting to study, but also there's that potential component, if it makes sense.
So yeah, really, really interesting topic and presentation, and a creative way to think about the data. I wanted to propose an alternative framing and see if you think it's consistent with your data. Okay. And then if it is, I have a result that I would like to hear if you've tested. So the alternative framing that I was thinking is, so you have it framed as sort of everyone hates moderates, right? Sort of a groupie thing. But I was wondering if you could frame it in terms of conceptualization, right? What it seems like to me is that these groups are polarizing around distinct concepts of what it means to be a group member. And in some ways, this is sort of a more normsy way of thinking about it, right? There are certain group norms surrounding the notion of what it means to be pro-life versus pro-choice, and those don't necessarily have to be the same conceptualization. Each group has their own definition. And if that is consistent with your results, then I wonder whether these results maybe have even bigger implications, which is that perhaps that's what's driving polarization, right? Is it that we actually disagree with each other? So to what degree is belief polarization as big as conceptual polarization in your data? I think might be an interesting thing to think about.
Yeah, I think that is an amazing point. And so like in the studies, I tell participants a million times, I'm just interested in your own personal view. Please do not think what others might perceive. So I'm really trying to get at their own feelings, but I can't exclude 100% that there's some of that, right? And I think they're probably very confounded with each other, right? The more strongly we feel about something, the more, as you said, we tend to polarize, and also like the norms change accordingly, right? So it's probably pretty hard to disentangle.
Well, just to clarify, I'm not talking about disentangling anything. I'm just talking about literally comparing your conceptual data from your beliefs data. So in other words, you have, like, your results all show that there's polarization, or at least the way I would interpret it as people who are pro-life have a definition of what it means to be pro-life, and that definition is conceptually distinct and polarized from people who say that they're pro-choice, right? So there's conceptual polarization in your data, and then you have a separate set of measures that actually measure polarization in personal beliefs. So we generally think about polarization in terms of personal beliefs, but something I'm really interested in, we've been working on, is this notion of polarization over concepts. And I think it's showing up in your data. At least that's how I would interpret them. But it's possible that I'm missing something. So.
Yeah, no. Are you the ones that study how to measure polarization?
A little bit.
Okay, we need to talk more about this because I think there's definitely something there, and that's probably part of what I observed in the last study, where I find the effect for a group, but not for the other, maybe because they have a different conceptualization of the polarization on that specific topic. And so, yes, I share your intuition, and the true answer is I don't know for sure, but it would definitely, I definitely want to think more about it.
Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you.